Welcome again to the Menagiér de Downham Market. This time we're going to do something a little different, as well as possibly have a cat put in an appearance. In the next March, which is to say March of 2021, I'm recording this in February of 2021, in the SCA Shire Polderslot, which is to say down in the Netherlands. They're going to be doing a food-based event, presumably online entirely. And one of the things that they wanted to do was give people a taste of a period recipe and see what sort of variations people came up with, which is a fascinating idea because we've got a lot of medieval recipes, and sometimes we tend to treat them as if they were fixed objects, which is not always the case. I mean, it's certainly not the case with modern cookery. If I tell you that I'm going to be making spaghetti with meatballs, then you get an idea of what I'm making, but you have no idea what my meatballs might look like compared to the meatballs that you make or that your friends make. And there are many examples. And with the medieval cookery in particular, one of the things that we bump into is the terminology is different. And so often we'll look at a recipe and think, this name refers to a specific dish. But sometimes it may not be referring to a dish, it's referring to a kind of food or a kind of dish. It would be the idea in the modern world where if I say I'm going to make a cake, that really doesn't tell you much, but at the same time we've got enough context that we can think about cake and have some idea of what we're going to make with it, although that's going to vary depending on where we live and the cultural context of what we think a cake is. A pie is even a better example. If you talk about pie in the United States, that gives you one sort of idea of what I'm talking about. But if you just say pie in England, it's a different kind of conception. Pudding, again. There are so many examples. But in any case, added to that for the medieval recipes, we don't have a lot to go on. They're not as detailed. So one of the challenges is looking at a minimalist recipe without context or without as much context and figuring out what to make with it. So the idea that we're going to give people or provide people some hooks into a medieval recipe and then let them have a go at it and then compare the results at the end is a fascinating one. So I spoke with the coordinators, and the recipe we came up with is Daryols. Now, the recipe that I'm going to use is from the form of curry, and it is the simplest, most straightforward version of this recipe that I could find without too much effort. And it says simply, take cream of cow milk, other of almonds, do thereto Erin with sugar, saffron, and salt, medal it fair, do it in a coffin of 2-inch deep, bake it well, and serve it forth. Now, there's a bunch to unpack in there, but it's pretty simple. Cream or almond milk, eggs, sugar, saffron, salt, mixed together, baked in a crust. I'm not even going to talk about the crusts. Medieval bread and medieval pastry is a topic which is deserving of much attention, much more than I've got, much more time, than I have to spend on it right now. But I will say that I opted for a period solution for the crust, which is I bought some at the shops and just used that. That is a perfectly reasonable medieval solution to dealing with things like that. There were certainly people who would sell you bread and or make your pies for you. So this is Jessie, who has come to put her paw in her 2 cents worth. So I'm using period or purchased crust. Come here, girl. And although you can't necessarily tell from just the recipe that I gave you whether or not it's supposed to be sweet or savory, if you poke around a little bit, you can start to get a better idea. So this is the basic recipe, which I'm going to be making here in just a few moments. But if you are interested in getting a handle on what a Daryol is in a more general sense, and or experimenting with variations on it, there are many other places that you can look. I would recommend starting looking in Austin's 2 15th century cookbooks, where he has several different Daryol recipes in there. Be careful looking for the spellings. It's not always going to be spelled the same way. The form of curry version is spelled D-A-R-Y-O-L-S, but you can find D-A-R-I, D-A-R-Y, all kinds of variations, but it's worth looking. And this is a good approach whenever you're looking at a medieval recipe for the first time, is to look and see if you can find variations on it to try to get your eye in on what is the distinctive character, what makes a Daryol in particular, in the same way that our cultural context tells us what makes a pie, or a pudding. So, enough of that. Let's go make a very, very basic Daryol. So the Daryol recipe that I am making is very simple, as previously mentioned. Calls for nothing but cream, eggs, sugar, saffron, and salt. There's nothing in there which specifically tells us whether this is supposed to be a sweet Daryol or a savory Daryol, but I decided to go for a sweet Daryol in this case. And we're definitely looking at something with a custardy texture. We're told to bake it well, put it in the dish with the coffin, and go for that. So I'm going to make a sweet egg custard, which I think is arguably what we're looking at here. Now, I've already made the crust. I've pre-baked it, blind baked it. As I said, I opted for the medieval solution of paying somebody else to make my pastry for me. And here it is, and I'm just going to fill it. I am taking, in order, cream of cow's milk. And I'm using heavy cream because I like heavy cream. And I'm going to put about 500 mils, 2 cups worth of heavy cream in there. And I'm going to lick my finger, and then I'm going to do there 2 eggs, and I've got 4 eggs, which I think should give me about the custard texture that I want once it's all cooked up. Eggs, sugar, saffron, salt. And it's hard to tell from this what sort of quantities we're talking about, but I'm going to put in just a pinch of salt. And likewise, just a pinch of saffron. I'm looking for something which will add a little bit of color to the Daryol, rather than a little bit more than I wanted, but that's all right. Color rather than a whole lot of flavor. And then I want a fairly sweet custard. So I'm going to put in about a half a cup of sugar. Mix those all together. I didn't beat the eggs before, because the instructions didn't tell me to. I'm meddling them specifically. Meddle it ifera. Mix it all together. Which is what I'm doing. And I do want the sugar to get pretty well dissolved, because I don't want it to sort of crust up and be grainy when it's cooked. But that's really all I'm doing. And you can start to smell now the saffron, and you can see that the color is yellowing up nicely. It's interesting that we were told specifically to put it into a trap, a coffin, 2 inches deep, which is an interesting distinction. I've gone for something which I could bake that deep, which suggests that that's not the standard, because if it was the standard, they probably wouldn't have felt the need to mention it to us. So why such a deep coffin for this particular Daryol? I don't have a particularly good answer. So, pretty well mixed together. I can hear that there's not a whole lot of graininess in the sugar left. The sugar's pretty well dissolved. I'm going to pour it into my slightly blind baked dish, where I didn't get the crust up quite high enough. Now, I did partially blind bake this, and that's because it seems like a good idea to me when I'm working with this sort of pastry. But if you look at some of the other recipes, you may see why I thought that blind baking it was a good idea. Now I'm just going to pop this in the oven, about 160 Celsius, and put that in there for, I'll start with half an hour or 45 minutes. Call it 45 minutes. And then see if it's set up. And if it hasn't, I'll stick it back in for a little bit longer. And that's good enough for that. So I started it out at 45 minutes, but it actually took about an hour 15. And then it puffed up, and then it's been cooling for a while. But this is what we ended up with, is a nice sort of egg custard. And this is my version, or at least my first take, on what the Daryol is. The simplest version of it. Just a simple egg custard, not a lot of flavor, not a lot of extra flavors, but you can see it's got a little bit of that yellow from the saffron. You can see it sharply there, but also throughout. A little bit of saffron, a little bit of sugar. It's got a nice texture. Whoop. And that's a first pass. So for the purposes of this exercise, have a look at that recipe if you want. Have a look at some of the other recipes, because whenever you're working with the medieval recipes, it's always good to look at as many different versions as you can to try to get the appropriate context for what you're working with. And then you just have to riff with it. You just have to go with what you've got. So here's my version of the Daryol. I look forward to seeing what you all come up with next month in Polderslot.